Chapter 1. Calamity and Kindness. When I heard the clicking heels descending the concrete steps to our poky flat in the basement, I stopped drawing for a moment, listening for the door knocker on my mum's broad Yorkshire tongue as she lashed a visiting rent collector or tallyman. But today was different. The footsteps were different. The voices were different. My mum was speaking softly to a woman, muffled behind the closed door of our tidy parlour. I was carefully shading in Mickey Mouse's mouth and eyes, planting a broad grin across his face, when the glimmering electric bulb above my head fizzled to nothing. "Ma'am," I called out. A burst of light suddenly struck me as my mum opened the cupboard where I was sitting in the darkness. "He likes to do his drawings in here," my mum explained to a stocky lady in bulging blue stockings who was peering in at me. "Come on, out they come." "He has a lot of hair, doesn't he?" observed the lady as I sprang from my cubbyhole. "His father was the same," my mum huffed. I showed my picture to the lady and she smiled, squinting against the low October sunshine which streamed through the rips in the curtain. "It's jolly good," praised the lady. "You like tracing?" she asked. I shook my head and I told her, "I never traced it, it's a sketch." "Really?" she uttered, somewhat surprised, then asked my mum, "How old is he?" "6. The lady glanced at my grubby feet and inquired, "Does he have any shoes?" My mum explained, "His brother's got 'em at present. He's to school today." "That's perfectly all right," the lady assured her, smiling sympathetically. "We have plenty." They went outside, and I heard the lady say in a hushed tone, "It's for the best, Mrs. Harris." After the lady had gone, my mum dug deep to find a tanner to put in the meter, and I returned to the privacy of my enchanted cupboard to continue with my sketch. When my brother Tony returned home, my mum called out from the scullery, "Max, in here, I need to speak to thee." We slurped mushy Weetabix biscuits in water as she told us, "Tomorrow you're going away on a wonderful trip, just you two. Not your brother Kenny nor your sister, just you two. You understand?" "How long are we going for, Mum?" asked Tony. "Not long, and you'd better behave yourselves," she warned. "And just to make things easier, Joe, you'll use your proper first name," she told Tony. "And you," she said, turning to me, "will call yourself Harold." "Harold?" I shrieked. "Harold Harris," she confirmed. "But why?" I grizzled. "My name's Max Brandrett, ain't it? Your brothers are Harris, your sister's an Harris, and you'll be an Harris. Harry Harris," she decreed. "Who ever heard of Max Harris? It doesn't sound right." Then, hugging us both tightly, she sniffed. "Joe and Harry, me two boys, me two precious boys." The next morning, Joey and I ran up the steps to sit on the wall outside the house to wait for whatever it was we were supposed to be waiting for. The ornate iron railings were missing, commandeered maybe 10 years earlier in the early 1940s to make Spitfires or tanks, and it meant that us boys could drop down to our flat like intrepid parachutists rather than use the steps. Above our flat were 3 further stories housing half a dozen families or more. The neighbours were friendly and they loved my mum. My mum wasn't the tallest, but she was pretty, and despite her second-hand clothes and scant makeup, she always looked well-groomed and fashionable. But it was her kindness and generosity that made her special. Spotting her neighbour, she would cry out in her loud as Gisborese, "Hey, don't stand there like a wet week. Come in for a cuppa and a fag." And she would have given away her last penny. Our road, Buckingham Road, Brighton, was a wide street of large Victorian terraced houses, mostly split into humble flats, occupied by railway workers and hotel skivvies like my mum. Some entire houses were the homes of rich families, and the reason my mum had moved south was to enter domestic service for the Powells, and particularly to care for an elderly gentleman. My mum held down 4 jobs, presumably because she couldn't hold down her husband. I didn't know my father. She had mentioned to me once that he was tall and handsome, theatrical and flamboyant, with a magnificent mane of wavy hair. I'd also heard her tell others that he was a womanising rat and a no-good spiv who made a living by duping punters into paying for his spurious racing tips. A shiny green Morris Minor traveller came into view up the street, chugging slowly in our direction. A man in the passenger seat was peering and pointing at the house numbers, gesticulating to the lady who was driving. Eventually, they came to rest alongside us. My heart pounded. "Hello," said the man in a loud, clear voice as he stepped out of the car. "Are you the Bernardos, boys?" We shrugged at him. He looked like a park keeper in his rough navy blue jacket. I didn't like him. The lady, however, was tall and elegant in a grey, velvet-trimmed coat and matching hat, and she wore spectacles like a schoolteacher. "Hello, boys," she greeted. "Where is your mother?" We led them down the steps and through to the scullery at the back. Mum was outside in the yard, ringing a penny through the mangle. She stopped abruptly and prinked her hair. "I'm Mrs. Gibson," said the lady, smiling and shaking my mum's hand. "This is Mr. Odin." "Here," said Mr. Odin, "we brought these for the boys," and he handed Tony and I a pile of neatly pressed clothes. Joey and I were sent to the bedroom to dress while the adults went into the parlour. We excitedly ripped off our ragged shorts and pullovers, flinging them in a messy pile on the floor, and adorned ourselves in their smart grey replacements. I pulled up my new itchy wool socks, and Tony helped me lace up my generous black shoes. I think my mum was quite shocked when she came from the parlour and saw us. "Do they have anything else to bring with them?" asked Mrs. Gibson, and my mum sheepishly shook her head. I grabbed my pencil and pair of stubby wax crayons, one green and one yellow, and my thin pad of thick coarse paper, and I was ready to go. "Joseph looks a little bow-legged," observed Mr. Odin. "Rickets?" enquired Mrs. Gibson. My mum nodded and sighed deeply. "I've tried to, but I just couldn't. It's all been so—" and I could see that she was overwhelmed and fighting to hold back her tears. "It's all right," comforted Mrs. Gibson. "We'll soon have him right." Outside, on the curb, my mum hugged us and kissed us on the cheeks. Then, wiping her eyes, she turned to Mrs. Gibson and asked pleadingly, "Will I be able to, will I ever see—" "They'll be well taken care of, Mrs. Harris," Mrs. Gibson assured her. "Harold," Mr. Odin called out, holding open the rear door of the traveller. "Harold," he snapped again. It was a moment before I realised that Harold was me. Joey and I climbed into the car and sat bolt upright on the back seat, as instructed. It was a lovely motor, with tan leather seats and a gleaming chromium steering wheel. The next-door neighbours, Mr. and Mrs. Russell, had come out to see us off, she with a fuddy-duddy 1940s hairstyle, and he in his dapper waiter's waistcoat and bow tie of the Southern Railway. As we drove away, I glanced through the rear-view mirror and saw my mum fall into Mrs. Russell's arms. "Would you like a lollipop?" asked Mrs. Gibson. Somewhere en route to wherever it was we were going, Mrs. Gibson stopped to drop Mr. Odin off. She pulled over by a park gate, and I nudged my brother in the ribs and whispered to him, giggling, "I told you he was a park keeper." When we set off again, I saw Mrs. Gibson's kindly eyes smiling back at me in the mirror. "Boys," she said gleefully, "I am taking you to a wonderful place." As I observed the changing landscapes, I drew cows and sheep, buildings and cranes, cars and horses. I felt almost overawed with subject matter. "This is it," Mrs. Gibson announced some hours later as we slowed down and turned in through a set of broad metal gates. "Can you read the sign?" We looked bemused. "It says, Dr. Bernardo's village. This is where you're going to live." We gawped out of the windows with bulging eyes. Our heads were spinning frantically from side to side. A vast garden opened up before us, lawns with circular beds of flowers and shrubs, fountains and gazebos, a large village green, a sports field, a swimming pool, dozens of pointy-roofed cottages, a church and a hospital, all encircled by a jungle of giant trees. It was magical. "This way, Harold," instructed a lady called Mrs. Carter as I tried to follow Joey, who was being led off in the opposite direction. "You are staying in Joy Cottage because you're a bedwetter. If you could be a good boy for 7 nights, we may let you join your brother." There were lots of boys in my dormitory. Obviously, I was the new boy. I knew no one and I knew nothing. Mrs. Carter showed me to my bed and introduced me to Dougie, who had the bed next to mine. After bread and jam and the Lord's Prayer read by Mr. Carter, we settled into our beds, and Dougie explained the drill. At 11:30, George comes. "Who's George?" I asked. "Sewer George, the sewer man," said Dougie. "He takes us to the bog if we're desperate for a slash. You'll see." The light went out, and I snuggled under my blanket, cheering myself up that it wouldn't be long before I was going home again. What seemed like a moment later, a man's voice echoed in the darkness. "You want to go? Do you want to go?" When the voice was above my head, I peered out and saw in the torchlight that Dougie was putting on his slippers. He beckoned me and I followed. We filed downstairs to the latrine and relieved ourselves. I went back to bed with a relieved mind and an empty bladder, but I still had to squeeze my legs together as tightly as I could. A woman's voice startled me, and the lights flashed on. I was so shaken that it took me a moment to realise that I had slept through the night and it was morning. The boys all leapt from their beds, and I did likewise. We lined up, 2 lines of 15 boys, and stood in silence as a fat nurse executed a bed inspection. She passed along the rows of beds, flicking back the blankets and wiping her chubby palm across our sheets. "Good boy. Nice and dry. Yes, good boy. Good boy. You dirty boy. Get this sheet off at once and wash it." It was still pitch black outside as the naughty boys were banished to the middle of the green to publicly scrub their bedsheets clean in a trough of icy cold water. The humiliation was seen as a cure for wicked and wilful bedwetters. And I so got used to the routine, I counted down the nights on my fingers. I had succeeded in not wetting the bed for 6 nights on the trot. Next was night 7. Hopefully my last night away from my dear, dear brother Tony/Joey, as long as I could hold it in. I went to bed. I was missing my brother immensely. I kept thinking about him. I was excited. I was anxious. I was tired. I was warm. I was warm. Then I heard Sewer George's voice in the darkness. "You want to go? Do you want to go?" I realised then that it was too late for me. I'd already gone. My heart pounded. I lay still, totally still, not moving and not breathing, but waiting. "You want to go?" And I heard Dougie stir and put on his slippers, and the padding of eager feet disappearing away down the steps. Under the cover of darkness, I slipped out of bed, yanked off my sodden bedsheet, grabbed Dougie's dry one, swiftly swapped them over, and was, far as anyone was concerned, still fast asleep when they returned. I heard Dougie get back into bed and wriggle and moan uncomfortably. In the morning, there was a hell of a furore. "You dirty boy, Dougie, dirty!" the nurse yelled, and then to me, "Oh, good boy, Harold, that's 7 dry nights. What a good boy you are." That evening I was sent to Angus Cottage, where I slept soundly under the watchful eye of my beloved brother. The weeks rolled by, and we ate 3 square meals a day, including meat, attended daily lessons at school, and the pain which Joey suffered because of his rickets began to ease off, thanks to the regular doses of revolting castor oil and cod liver oil prescribed by the fat nurse. Joey was always looking out for me and standing up to any bullies that I couldn't sort out myself. We loved the fact that we had a proper football pitch at our feet, and we were each given our own football kit, Arsenal for me and Chelsea for him. We wanted for nothing, except a cuddle from our mum. I think I missed her more than Joey did, although I suspect he put on a brave face so as not to upset me. We did receive letters from her, telling us that she missed us and loved us, and urging us to behave ourselves. It was a great comfort, and I felt sure any day soon Mrs. Gibson would arrive and take us back to Brighton. Although I did cry most days, as many of the children did, the village was a happy place, and I was luckier than most because I could escape into my drawings. I'd been supplied with pencils and crayons and paper, and I would while away any spare moments escaping into my little private world. It was exciting because Christmas was coming. I did pictures of the landscape and the cottages, all covered in icicles and snow and cheeky grey squirrels and robin redbreasts. We all helped decorate a huge Christmas tree with tinsel and baubles and sprigs of holly and pine cones plucked from the trees. The boys all took it in turns to help the girls stirring the Christmas pudding in a giant bowl. Father Christmas came and handed us each a bulging pillowcase. I was flabbergasted when I put my head inside and discovered a kingdom of toys. There were soldiers and horses, a car, a lorry, a lion, a jack-in-the-box and an aeroplane, all chipped hand-me-downs, but I was as happy as a lark. Later, after we were stuffed with roast and pudding, we had given thanks to the Lord, we were each called onto the stage in the main hall and presented with another special toy. Mine was a wooden duck on a cart, with a rope to pull it along. It only had 3 wheels, but I thought it was smashing. We had been at Bernardo's in Barkingside for a year or so when Mrs. Gibson came back for us. She smiled warmly and ushered Joey and I into the back of the Morris. This time we actually had things, such as clothes, to take with us. "Are we going to see my mum?" I asked Mrs. Gibson as we drove away from the waving children and carpets of fresh bluebells under the trees. "You're going to stay with the Andersons," she replied. "You remember the Andersons, don't you?" I remained silent, disappointed and sad that I wouldn't be seeing my mum. "They are a kind American family who visit the village sometimes and bring toys for the children. You liked them when you met them, and they especially like you." The concrete prefab houses quickly gave way to green fields and twittering hedgerows. We passed a farmer with a giant shire horse, and some boys playing on top of a pillbox, and an airfield with bombers. At the end of the leafy lane, I recognised the car immediately. It was maroon, almost purple, and big. Behind it stood a large white house with black wooden beams and 4 tall chimneys. Mr. and Mrs. Anderson and their 2 sons came out to greet us. They had their own television set, with a magnifying glass which enlarged the people's heads to the size of our own. We had wonderful times, all of us playing hide and seek in the orchard and outbuildings. We polished the car and did chores in the garden. But most of all, we adored the drives out into the countryside for picnics and to the seaside to play baseball on the beach and swim in the sea. Mr. Anderson owned a washing machine factory. He was rich. "Sit down, boys. Mrs. Anderson and I would like to talk to you," said Mr. Anderson. "The thing is, boys, we have grown fond of you over these past months, and we were wondering whether you would like to live with us all the time." "Yes, please," Joey and I both said together. "Great. But here's the thing," he continued hesitantly. "We're moving back to America, so we'd have to adopt you, and we'd all live in America. How does that grab you?" "The only thing is," Mrs. Anderson cut in, "we'd have to ask your mum for her permission first, before we could do anything. She'd have to agree or—" The news wasn't good. Mum didn't agree. Mrs. Anderson hugged me, and as she said goodbye, I wept bitterly and mourned what might have been. "I've got you some lollipops," smiled Mrs. Gibson as we drove away. Watts Naval Training School was a Bernardo's home which was pretty much as close to being on a ship whilst remaining on dry land. It had extensive grounds and a main, vast old building, 3 stories high, which looked more like a cathedral than a ship, but it was run exactly like a ship. I was put in a dormitory with Joey up on the 2nd floor on Lincoln Landing. The ship's company comprised of 300 boys or more, and we worked to a rigid naval timetable. At 6:30 a.m. the bugle would wake us up and would jump out of bed, wash face, brush teeth, brush hair, clipped short by the barber, dress in uniform shirt and shorts, ronic, polish the wooden decks, attend prayers, eat our breakfast in the mess hall. Then, At 9 a.m., we were marched out onto the parade ground in the front of the building and drilled up and down in perfect unison. In the centre of the square was a towering mast, commandeered from a bygone warship called HMS Woodlark. Standing to attention, we would be inspected by the captain, and God help us if we didn't pass muster. Any untidiness or imprecision, and we were hoiked out for punishment. I was a grog boy, tea boy, which kept me on the right side of the masters, but unfortunately it meant I had to wait outside the cookhouse door for delivery of a giant teapot, and couldn't eat until I'd poured out dozens and dozens of cups of tea. Sometimes, when I did get to sit down at one of the long tables, the prefect would tease me and think it funny to deprive me of food. It was as a result of this that I got dysentery. Hungry and scrumping for pears in the orchard one day, one of the fruits must have been dirty and I ended up being as sick as a dog in the infirmary. A week after I was discharged, I still couldn't face any food, despite the fact that it was my 7th birthday. One of the masters, a kindly soul called Colonel Dean, and his lovely wife, who was always respectfully addressed as Ma'am Dean, invited me for a celebration tea at their cottage. She served me paste sandwiches and cake, but when she had left the room, I threw them out of the window. The next day, she summoned me to see her. "Guess what the gardener's dog found just there, outside the window?" she asked me. "Dunno, Mum," I shrugged. "I think you do," she insisted, "but I'm worried about you. You're very thin. You must eat." And she leaned forwards to give me a corned beef sandwich. "Mom Dane," I moaned, staring up at her wide-eyed, "you never kissed me on my birthday." She chuckled and smiled. "And if I give you a kiss, Harold, do you promise me you'll start eating again?" I nodded enthusiastically, grinning from ear to ear, and her warm lips brushed my cheek, and I was instantly cured of dysentery. "I have something else for you," she said, and handed me a large, expensive colouring-in book. "I know how much you love to draw, and I've seen how beautiful your pictures are." "Thank you," I politely acknowledged. Some time later, in the garden, she looked over my shoulder and asked, "May I look?" I could see that she was puzzled as she flipped through the pages of printed black-line drawings. "But you haven't coloured any of them in." "I'm sorry, Mom Dean," I said, looking at the ground shamefaced, "but I don't like colouring. I like drawing." Then, flicking through the formerly blank pages on the reverse side, she gasped, "Did you do these?" I nodded nervously as she examined my work, a dramatically shaded autumn landscape, a sketch of the school chapel, a respectful and glamorous cartoon of her, plus various pictures of cars, boats, trains, and hedgehogs. "Well, Harold, you really are quite the John Constable," she praised. She obviously passed on her glowing approval to the masters, as I was called to one side by a teacher called Mr. Runcie, and presented with a box of watercolours, oil paints, and art paper. And in order to avoid the boys who liked to deride and antagonise me, I was also granted special permission to paint my pictures in the peace and privacy of the school's museum. It certainly suited me, and it proved to be a wonderful advertisement for the school when visiting dignitaries paused to watch me paint. Joey and I were told that we had been accepted for placement in a foster home in Suffolk. It was considered that I might benefit from the surroundings, and my brother would be taken in with me. Mrs. Gibson arrived, and we climbed onto the back seat of the traveller, on our way to another adventure. "I haven't actually met the Reverend," said Mrs. Gibson, "but I feel sure that he's a very nice man." "What's a Reverend?" I asked. "A rector," she replied. "You know what a rector is, don't you?" "It's like a vicar," said Joey. "Oh," I sighed. "Will he be taking us to America?" Mrs. Gibson passed us each a lollipop. "Now, follow me up here, boys," directed the Reverend Sodden, stooping as he went upstairs and onto the landing, his pipe smoke trailing behind him like a steam train. "This is my office, and in here, this is where Lord Nelson's mother was born." "Are there any ghosts?" asked Joey. Of course there's no ghosts in the rectory, huffed Mrs. Fish, the housekeeper. Well, I've never seen one. And along here, continued the Reverend, is your bedroom. Joey and I peered inside at the two little beds that were almost lost in such a large room. The Cavaliers hid from the Roundheads in the rectory during the English Civil War. Are all these pictures yours? I asked as we trotted along behind him through the maze of passageways and rooms, upstairs and downstairs. Most of the portraits belong to the church, he answered. Personally, I prefer landscapes. Barsham Rectory was beautiful. We climbed the trees in the surrounding woodland, swam and fished for tiddlers in the River Waveney. The nearby school was a cheerful place, and when I wasn't chasing the girls, I painted. I did a watercolour of the Anglo-Saxon church and an oil painting of Lord Nelson, which I copied from a book. It was a busy house, with visitors coming and going, and we had wonderful meals. But when I felt lonely or sad, I would sit next to the fish pond and think about my mum. The Reverend Sodden was a kind and gentle man. I am very sorry, boys, he apologised one day, coughing weakly into his handkerchief, but I'm afraid that it is no longer possible for you to stay here. Mrs. Gibson arrived and told us that Mrs. Fish, the Reverend's housekeeper, and her husband were prepared to take us in. Much to our glee, we were delivered to a village sweet shop, which was run by Mr. Fish. He was a nice, if naive man, and the temptation of living above a limitless supply of Horlick's tablets and Mars bras proved too much for us. In a matter of weeks it was noted that the stocks of sweets were much depleted. Mrs. Gibson returned to collect us, and this time there were no lollipops to console us on the long and silent trek back to the Naval Training School. The school had its own railway station, and when the boys were old enough to leave, we would take a short walk to Bintry Lane to board a train to freedom. A special made-up song would ring out as they left, expressing a widespread desire to escape. On occasions, pupils would run away as far as the station, only to perish under a train. It wasn't talked about. My brother and I kept our noses clean and managed to ingratiate ourselves to the master sufficiently that we were included in a school cramping trip to the north coast of the county. 70 boys travelled the short distance by railway and hiked the final mile to an empty field above the beach. Upon arrival, we built our tents and dug latrines, before plunging into the cold grey waves for swimming races. As well as football and cricket, the masters also planned a devilish cross-country race. Although Norfolk was supposedly a flat county, the circuit would include running up a hill to the peak of an impossibly tall cliff, referred to by the locals as Beast and Bump, then back down again, then away across some miles of scrubland, then back up to the pinnacle to the finishing line. It was a daunting challenge, but the winner would receive a mouth-watering prize of £5. It was, I decided, an opportunity too good to miss. As I padded breathlessly through the heavy mounds of sand, I spotted my chance to cut out a huge chunk of the exhausting route by hiding in some bushes. I crouched down and waited there, and presently, when the 3 leading boys came chugging by, I darted out behind them and ran like their clappers. My ears were suddenly ringing with the cheers and yells of the enthusiastic masters. "Go on, Harris! Go on, boy!" As I sprinted past my weary competitors and flung myself through the winner's tape, they gasped begrudgingly. "Well done, Harris," though there was more than a hint of suspicion in their tone. "Never had you down as a runner, Harris. Well done," said Colonel Dean as he shook my hand and awarded me my silver half-crown. My victory didn't go unnoticed, and, apart from the cash, it earned me a kiss the following day from a girl on the beach. She had blonde curly hair, but not only on her head. I couldn't help but notice she had a sprig of fluff sprouting from the side of her swimming costume. It fascinated me, so much so that I made a sketch of her, complete with her frizzy adornment. I was later confronted by an outraged teacher who pointed at the offending matter with disgust and demanded, "And what is this boy?" It's public hair, sir, I answered quite innocently, and was summarily corrected for my insolence. It was always slightly nerve-wracking to be summoned down into the basement of the school where the offices were located. Joey and I were called in and told, "Your mother's coming to see you." We hadn't seen her for some years, and I was both excited and apprehensive. "She ain't coming. Seen a couple of boys on the way to the playing field, and I scrapped with them until they were bruised and blooded and ran away." It was a crisp, bright morning, and I eagerly washed, dressed, prayed, and ate, aching with pent-up excitement. I waited for the whistle to blow, then fell into rank and marched smartly out onto the parade square. I lifted my chin and raised my feet higher than usual, and marched along with a spring in my step. Although the drill dictated that we maintain eyes front, I felt my gaze wavering, spontaneously seeking out my mum's wavy, coiffured locks. It was Joey who spotted her and subtly gestured for me to raise my attention upwards. On the next pass, I glanced up and saw her standing aloft on the top-floor balcony, with shorter hair and a strange man on her arm. "Tummy rumbling?" the captain asked as I stood to attention for his inspection. "I've got the collywobble, sir," I told him, which caused a titter amongst the boys. "Pull your socks up, boy," he commanded. Then to his aide, "Hole in sock, on report." Before the obligatory punishment of standing out on deck for half an hour, I was granted permission to see my mum for 10 minutes. She hugged Joey and I together, squashing us and planting soppy red kisses across our mouths and cheeks, and then shrieked, "By heck, boys, look how you're grown. They must be feeding you right." Smiling doe-eyed at her companion, she announced to us, "Boys, this is Sid." He was a stocky man with large hairy hands which barely protruded from the sleeves of his black oversized jacket. "Sid's living with me now," said my mum. "He's from Newcastle. You'll love him. He used to work down pit." "Aye, I love this woman to death," purred the Geordie coal miner, and suddenly he burst into song, serenading me mum with a rendition of "On the Street Where You Live," filling the cold air with how tall and heartened he felt, just to have my mum nearby. My mum stared sweetly into his eyes and they kissed on the lips. "Mum, are we going home?" I asked. "Not today, darling," she sighed. She gazed at me longingly and stroked my face, her smile bathing me in a moment of warmth. Her eyes sparkled with sadness. She didn't cry, none of us cried, and then she was gone. My favourite spot at school when I wanted to be completely alone was down on the river bank, beyond the open-air swimming pool. I would sit there and weep, reflecting upon the quietly passing water and singing an Irish ballad about people who found themselves a long way from home. If you ever go across the sea to Ireland, then maybe at the closing of your day, you will sit and watch the moon rise over Claddagh and see the sun go down on Galway Bay, just to hear again the ripple of the trout stream, the women in the meadows making hay. I didn't know what it was called or where I picked it up from, or truly what it was about, but it made me feel better. Mrs. Gibson came and took us to a place called Bell Farm, somewhere near Ipswich. "Best behaviour, boys," Mrs. Gibson warned us. "This could be your last chance of being fostered." When we arrived, the shabby wooden door squeaked open, and a little man with a handlebar moustache appeared. "Who is that?" boomed a woman's voice from indoors. "Is it the orphans?" "Yes, my dear, it's the orphans," the man called back. Then to Mrs. Gibson, with a pronounced Suffolk burr, "I'm Arthur. Come in, lads." A hairy-faced woman in a billowing frock came bouncing into the overcrowded parlour and flung her flabby arms around us and slobbered all over us. "This be Mabel, my missus," grinned Arthur. The woman spurted excitedly. "We're so excited, ain't we, Arthur?" "Yes, my dear," Arthur instantly replied. "Most excited." Mrs. Gibson left us boys with a telling raise of her eyebrow. "Oh, look at you, you're so adorable," drawled Madam Mabel. "Give us a kiss." Mr. Arthur giggled nervously as his wife accosted us with her tongue. "Have you had your dinner?" she asked. "I've got dinner. Now, you sit down here and—" "May I go to the toilet, please?" I requested. "Toilet, toilet, yes, this way," she bade me. "Now, what's your name again?" "Harold," I said. "Harold, what a lovely name," she complimented as I followed her through the tight, smoky kitchen. Opening the back door, she pointed outside to an ancient brick privy and handed me some pages of old newspaper. There's no lavatory or cistern, just a metal bucket. "There, sit down at the kitchen table, young Harold," she prompted when I'd returned from my pee. "Arthur, you lay out the plates. Hurry up or it'll be cold. Arthur!" "Right, my love," he uttered, and quickly set out some cracked, off-white dinner plates. Mom Mabel carefully lowered a large, steaming, sizzling pot onto a landing pad in the centre of the table. We looked on excitedly as she lifted the lid and great puffs of delicious steam erupted from the vessel. She dipped a blackened ladle into the depths of the bowl, then sloshed out some disgusting grey, greasy gloop onto our plates. "Don't be shy," she slurped, spitting projectiles of chomped-up chicken skin into our faces. We held onto our stomachs and stared at our plates, trying to ignore the horror as she slobbered away through flesh and bones, devouring legs and wings and the parson's nose. When she had finished, she let out a series of short belches, slumped back on her creaking chair, and instructed us to clear up the plates and wash them. Arthur assisted us and gave us directions on how to pump up water from the well. Mabel departed, and we later find her in the parlour, drifting away on a tiny sofa, humming along to Bing Crosby on the wireless. "Do light the lamp, Arthur," she grumbled. There was an unfamiliar hiss of gas, then a glowing white illumination from the brass lamp on the wall. Almost every inch of the walls and shelves were filled with pictures and trinkets, mainly miniature jugs and floral plates. There must have been hundreds of them. Sit here," she urged us, patting the dusty cushions on either side of her. We sat down, and she spread her weighty arms across our shoulders. "Ben Crosby was called Harold," she divulged, kissing me wetly on the cheek. "Harold Lillis. Did you know that?" I didn't. "There, you're famous," she beamed, kissing me again and again. In the morning, we were woken up at 6 a.m. and we washed ourselves down in the yard and given vile bread and dripping. The local school was 2 miles away as the crows flew, but further on foot. It was obvious from the moment we walked through the gates that we weren't welcome. "Stick with me," said Joey, as a dozen sets of hostile eyeballs followed us across the playground. At playtime, a ruffian snarled at me. "Oi, foundling, can yer fight?" Joey wasn't there. I was on my own. The boy was bigger than me. Kids circled around to watch. I punched him in the face. He grabbed my throat and tried to pull my head down. I overbalanced him and we rolled around on the tarmac, wrestling and kicking. Suddenly, I found myself suspended by the collar, my feet dangling above the ground. "You want to fight, lads?" boomed the gorilla-like man with curly sideboards, who held myself and my combatant aloft, one in each hand. Apart from semaphore signals and swimming, what's naval school taught you to be tough? Kitted out in giant boxing gloves, I socked the bully in the face and guts and didn't stop, even when he was quivering and sobbing in a heap on the ground. The thatched roof at Bell Farm was in disrepair and prone to leaks during heavy downpours. Joey and I would cuddle our stone hot water bottles and huddle under an old patchwork bedspread in an attempt to dodge the drips. I was normally sent to bed at 7 p.m. There, I would listen to Johnny Ray and Doris Day on a crystal set which I'd made myself, while Joey would have to stay downstairs in the parlour and listen to the likes of Mrs. Dale's Diary and The Archers. Although we hated having no running water or toilet or electricity, the Christmas we spent at the farm was a happy one. We helped to decorate a glorious Christmas tree in the parlour. Arthur built a blazing log fire in the hearth. Mabel cooked a tasty goose. We sang lively carols, and I was given a smart pen and pencil set. It was bitterly cold outside, but we enjoyed jumping around in the snow, flinging snowballs, and making snowmen and snow women. My paintings of the winter landscapes, horses, and military generals were much loved by Mabel and Arthur, as well as by the teachers at the school. I was dozily dreaming, half asleep under the bed cover one evening, as David Whitfield crooned, "I'll make you mine, forever mine, on this our wedding day. The bells will ring, the choir will sing." Thud! The room shook. I jumped up with a start and looked frantically all around in the darkness. I nervously got out of bed and crept down the stairs to the parlour, my heart racing. The door was open. Joey looked over at me, shocked. Mabel was lying flat on her back on the floor. Arthur was kneeling next to her. He was gently slapping her cheeks. She groaned. "Quick, get help!" Arthur yelled. "Quick!" I ran out the lane, barefoot and breathless, and slammed the neighbour's door knocker. We ran back. Arthur was crying. Mabel was still. More neighbours came. Arthur looked pale and drank brandy. They covered Mabel's body with a bedsheet. The doctor arrived. A gang of men lifted Mabel up and laid her on the kitchen table. Joey and I were sent to bed. When Mrs. Gibson came in the morning, she was truly sympathetic and gave us lollipops. She didn't take us back to Watts. "Where we're going is a marvellous school," she told us. "It's a technical school where you can learn to be a motor mechanic or an electrician." Its official title was the William Baker Technical School, but it was simply known as Goldings, a name retained from its former glory as one of the grandest country houses in the whole of Hertfordshire. "So, boys, what sort of thing would interest you?" inquired Mr. Wheatley, the mild-mannered headmaster, leaning back in his chair and twiddling his thumbs. Joey shrugged his shoulders, and I replied, "Painting, sir." "Ah!" Mr. Wheatley exclaimed, jolting his head back and smiling. "Excellent, Harold. We teach boys painting and decorating here. I feel certain that we will make an excellent tradesman of you." Joey and I decided to learn printing, in preference to decorating, bootmaking or tin bashing or gardening. I hated it, although I was encouraged to paint in my spare time, pictures rather than walls, when Mr. Wheatley realised that I had a talent for art. There was a printing press in the old stable block, and there I tried to understand the tedious and laborious intricacies of typesetting, which even our teacher of typography admitted was a puzzling business. Life at Goldings was less strict than the military-style regime we'd been used to, and therefore was open to a dash of disrespect and recklessness. Although the teachers were generally committed to furnishing us 250 boys with a brighter future, some seemed to look upon school life as a war between them and us. We named our enemies the Gestapo, and their most ardent member was a bully boy called Baldwin. Outside the upstairs landings were fire escapes, and these were seen as, and sometimes used as, stairways to freedom. And so, on a warm summer's night, I instigated a daring escape plan. 7 of us, including my brother Joey, carried supplies commandeered from the cookhouse, and went over the top, descending undetected into the garden below. Creeping silently across the lawn, we observed the enemy fraternising in the downstairs mess. We proceeded with caution, using the cover of the bushes until we were far enough away to make a run for it, and we didn't stop running until we were away and into the woods. Beyond the trees lay our goal, the magnificent River Bean, where we planned to set up a base camp on the river bank. When we reached the water's edge, we larked around in the moonlight, laughing and joking, but falling silent with fear every time a twig snapped or the undergrowth rustled or a dog barked in the distance. We woke up with a shiver in the morning, and the river was blanketed with a cloud of floating mist. Water rats scampered about, ducking and diving in the swirling currents amongst the weeds and rushes. We ate some of our plain biscuits and some bread and jam, then charged around playing football and cricket. The sun rose, and we lazed about on the grass, making the most of not having to do chores or studies, and not being told what to do. As the day warmed up, We all stripped off and jumped into the river and swam and splashed around like a bunch of crazy kids. In the afternoon, we snapped off some branches to make a shelter before plunging into the cool, clear water once again. The next morning, after a comfortable night's rest on beds of leafy twigs and grass, we had our breakfast and played in the sunshine, rejoicing in the fact that we were free. We made spears out of sticks and tried to stab fish, but failed. There were enough biscuits and bread to keep us going, although minor pangs of hunger were quite normal to us anyway. The river water was fresh, and we splashed around, frolicking and laughing like a pack of boisterous hyenas. Suddenly, there was a whinny and a clip-clopping of hooves. We stood up and stared. A farmer was sitting on a hay cart a distance away, staring back at us. A girl in a long frock was sitting next to him, also staring. We were naked. The man smacked his horse and they disappeared. "D'you think he'll tell anyone?" the other boys nervously asked me. "Nah, he won't be bothered," I reassured them. We were all still bathing and roughhousing when the expeditionary force burst out of the woods. "Harris!" yelled the Gestapo leader, Herr Baldwin. Baldwin's devil-eyed lieutenant, Herr Pratt, stood smirking at his side, and his smirk remained when, later, he thrashed my bare ass in front of the entire school. My cohorts were less severely dealt with, based on the presumption that I was the ringleader. It was Joey's time to leave school. At 16 years old, he was considered to be a young man, old enough to make his own way in the world. As he walked away towards the railway station, I stood with a tear in my eye and sang him the old song from Watts Naval School, "Leaving down Bintry Lane." Life dragged on. They persisted in trying to teach me about the print trade, despite my total lack of enthusiasm. I managed to stand it for another year, filling my time as much as possible with painting. Finally, I received my call into Mr. Whitley's office. I was given £10 and a train pass, along with his wise words: "Be lucky, be happy, and stay out of trouble, Harris." "Yes, sir, I'll be keeping well out of trouble, sir," I grinned. And so, with a few odd bits of clothing and my paints in a haversack, I stepped out into the big wide world to begin my life.